File 19 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 3, Section 4, of the component parts of our reasonings concerning causes and effects. Though the mind, in its reasonings from causes or effects, carries its view beyond those objects which it sees or remembers, it must never lose sight of them entirely, nor reason merely upon its own ideas without some mixture of impressions, or at least of ideas of the memory, which are equivalent to impressions. When we infer effects from causes, we must establish the existence of these causes, which we have only two ways of doing, either by an immediate perception of our memory or senses, or by an inference from other causes, which causes, again, we must ascertain in the same manner, either by a present impression or by an inference from their causes, and so on, till we arrive at some object which we see or remember. It is impossible for us to carry on our inferences in infinitum, and the only thing that can stop them is an impression of the memory or senses beyond which there is no room for doubt or inquiry.
With regard to, or compared to my recent, recent the video, the part in my series here before this one, prior to this one, I made a preliminary statement about my approach to cause and effect or causality as such. And I think it's quite a lot in agreement with Hume. Fundamentally, I think in agreement, and what I am very satisfied with is that he mentions memory, and I'm trying to find it once again. Yeah, when we infer effects, it's a very long sentence, this one, right? When we infer effects from causes, and talking about inferences, right? Infer is, okay, I think I need to say this about that, sort of. You're inferring somehow, right? And I'm not actually quite sure what is entailed in the understanding of an inference, because it seems to me that it's a getaway card or get out of jail card, or avoiding actual rigid argumentation when philosophers, quote, use an inference is, okay, I will just use an inference, then I will get ahead, right? When I can't argue or you make logical statements or anything like that, I'll just make an inference then, because I guess that's what I have to do then, right? So I always I put on my very skeptical hat when I hear the term inference. But Hume is not saying that he's going to infer, but he is referring to a common way of approaching understandings, in some cases called inferences, right? And then he says we must establish the existence of these causes. It has to have existence, right? And I would say if it has existence, it has to have impression. That would be my understanding, right? Which we have only two ways of doing, either by an immediate perception, right? Impression, perception, immediate perception. That could also be an idea, an immediate idea, right? But in his philosophy, only complex ideas can be abstracted from simple ideas, right? Complex ideas can be established abstractively from simple ideas. That doesn't necessarily have yet had an impression for you. But if there is a perception, there is at least an idea or an inference. And if there is an impression. But if there's an impression, there is an idea. And if there is an idea, there must have been an impression, unless it's some kind of abstraction, right? These abstractions are important to note about Hume's, because that's possibly where the sinkhole of all sorts of bullshit philosophy comes through, right? It comes through this, I can establish some kind of abstraction out of some inference, whatever, and then I can knock myself out in my philosophy, right? That you can take a polar bear and stick 4 legs, 7 horns, and 20 tomatoes on it mentally doesn't mean that that's a part of experience, right? You could say it's a part of your experience. But when we are dealing with each other, so to say, there are some fundamental things that I have to settle in order to get to the point where I can start to tell other people about my polar bears, right? And if we have to agree upon them, those imaginations don't matter. We can only agree upon our ideas then, right? Our artificial, complex ideas. Why would we want to do that? We would like to agree upon that which can actually have an impression, like a polar bear, right? That one which is white and have 4 legs and a snout, whatever, right? That we would like to agree upon, because if we see it, we might have to agree upon what to do about it, right? But we don't need to agree about a 12-legged polar bear that is orange with 6 horns in its ass, right? Because then we could knock ourselves out in abstract ideas. So that's why I'm saying be careful with abstract ideas. And I would think that Hume is implicitly pointing to these problems with these abstract, complex ideas that has no bearing in an impression, which we only have 2 ways of doing, either by immediate perception of our memories, of our memory or senses. Now that's where and I haven't read this before, but I guess you have to trust me, right? Immediate perception of our memory. I would say, personally, memory is not a perception. But in his dichotomy or categorization, it is. But I would like to keep them separate in my ontology. But that's not Hume's fault. I'm not blaming Hume. It's his ontology, right? Of our memory or senses, or by an inference, right? So if we put inferences aside, which usually something like, well, I guess there are causation then. I'm inferring causation. Yeah, okay, you're just using a fancy term that sounds like you, because you say yourself, call yourself a philosopher, then you get to do these inferences where you can come up with whatever you want. So, an immediate or by inference from the causes, from other causes, right? So it's an inference from our other causes. So there was a cause that can infer another cause from that, but ad infinitum, right? And an immediate perception of our memory or senses. That's basically what I said in my prior part. I haven't read this before, and I guess you have to trust me, as I say, right? But it's lovely that this kind of alignment, that if we have the same approach to philosophy, we are limited by our own approach, and it will, for good or worse maybe, go in a particular direction, and we will attack various problems in the same fashion. And if it seems, this has been haunting philosophers ever since, right? Maybe not ever since, but in some periods since, mostly in the last 100 or 150 years, where people have really dug into Hume, right? That the causation problem, the is-ought gap, and the inference, and causation, I would think, is connected, right? But most notably, causation and the is-ought. He's just pointing to people making some kind of leap because they feel they need to. And then they sort of are able to convince themselves that they can do these kinds of, deductions or inferences or whatever they call it, right? Out of nowhere, right? So it's not that you cannot say, I am working from the axiom of cause and effect because of what my memory, how it's put together, and how when I analyze my memory, I seem to see a pattern here, and I would like to take advantage of that pattern. I am working from the axiom of some kind of connection between events or memories of events, and expectations of events in the future. If this is the case, then that would happen, right? So I'm working from that axiom. Nobody can take that away from me. But I'm not trying to make a pretense of some kind of perception of it, or some kind of inference from something else that there must be. You can infer it that because this object is here now it touches that other object, and therefore when that object does this, it's because there's some connection between them, right? The connection, if there is anything, is your decision to treat it as such, right? That is an axiom. That is not a deduction. It's not an inference. It's not logic. It's nothing. It's not philosophical, right? That's what he tries to point at, in my opinion. Okay.
To give an instance of this, we may choose any point of history and consider for what reason we either believe or reject it. Thus, we believe that Caesar was killed in the Senate House on the Ides of March, and that because this fact is established on the unanimous testimony of historians who agree to assign this precise time and place to that event. Here are certain characters and letters present either to our memory or senses, which characters we likewise remember to have been used as the signs of certain ideas. And these ideas were either in the minds of such as were immediately present at that action and received the ideas directly from its existence, or they were derived from the testimony of others, and that again from another testimony by a visible gradation till we arrive at those who were eyewitnesses and spectators of the event. It is obvious all this chain of argument or connection of causes and effects is at first founded on those characters or letters which are seen or remembered, and that without the authority either of the memory or senses, our whole reasoning would be chimerical and without foundation. Every link of the chain would in that case hang upon another, but there would not be anything fixed to one end of it capable of sustaining the whole, and consequently there would be no belief nor evidence. And this actually is the case with all hypothetical arguments or reasonings upon a supposition, there being in them neither any present impression nor belief of a real existence.
Okay, so he goes into, when you go back, what you call the idea, you have received an idea of a particular, you have an instance of a particular idea that is told to you as a part of what is called history, for instance, Caesar, right? You have been told a story. You haven't, I suppose, right? Let me take it from my point of view. I haven't experienced Caesar. I have just, because there is a hole in my memory before I was born, so to say, right? There is sort of human beings don't like holes in things, in their philosophy, so to say, or the parts they can't get to, right? Says there's a tendency to fit a story into your memory, and that becomes a part of the memory, or the gray zone between the story and a memory, you could say, right? So you align yourself a story about what happened way down in the past as a kind of memory that eventually in this string of events ends up being you being born, and then you add to this set of memories, so to say, right? But my memory is my memory, and my memory is based on my perceptions. And whoever came up with the idea of Caesar was somebody having perceptions and getting some idea from that perception. Now, when they tell other people about their perceptions, then that statement is no longer a memory or a perception. It's a story being told that you can sort of adapt into your own system, right? Because everybody talks about Caesar, so I guess there was somebody called Caesar, right? This is sort of problematic because it gives us this sense, it's the way that the mind and the memory works, that things are sorted in this structure, separated by time, a mental idea of time, that gives it this causal nature, causal structure, right? You can't move, yourself back in time to, what I did yesterday, I actually want to place that when I was 2 years old. I mean, you can maybe in some abstract fashion do that and paint it, write it onto paper, but you can't do it to your mind or your memory. It doesn't work. So it's locked in this causal structure. And because it's locked in that way, I customize myself to think in a causal way. And that's why I'm attaching causal structure to my experiences. Because that's how my memory and mind works and approaches it and takes advantage of it, you could say, right? If I can maybe can't come, but it's everywhere in my everyday, right? I expect when I, open my laptop that the screen comes on and, I can do this, do that, do the other. There's so many things built in just to starting this little video here. Things I expect to be the case based on some idea of cause and effect, right? I've opened this laptop now hundreds, if not thousands of times, right? And it just keeps doing it. At some point it might stop, but that's not because there isn't causation. There's just another problem that is affecting the situation. So it's an idea. It's not even an idea. It's in a human way, it's a adherence to a pattern and using that to predict future outcomes, future effects, right? And if you align yourself with those effects, using your free will, right, you can get the benefit of those effects, right? That's kind of obvious. I don't think it's that difficult.
I need not observe that it is no just objection to the present doctrine that we can reason upon our past conclusions or principles without having recourse to those impressions from which they first arose. For even supposing these impressions should be entirely effaced from the memory, the conviction they produced may still remain. And it is equally true that all reasonings concerning causes and effects are originally derived from some impression in the same manner as the assurance of a demonstration proceeds always from a comparison of ideas, though it may continue after the comparison is forgotten. End of File 19. File 20 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager, Book 1, Part 3, Section 5, of the Impressions of the Senses and Memory. In this kind of reasoning, then, from causation, we employ materials which are of a mixed and heterogeneous nature, and which, however connected, are yet essentially different from each other. All our arguments concerning causes and effects consist both of an impression of the memory or senses and of the idea of that existence which produces the object of the impression or is produced by it. Here, therefore, we have three things to explain. That is, first, the original impression. Secondly, the transition to the idea of the connected cause or effect. Thirdly, the nature and qualities of that idea. As to those impressions which arise from the senses, their ultimate cause is, in my opinion, perfectly inexplicable by human reason, and it will always be impossible to decide with certainty whether they arise immediately from the object, or are produced by the creative power of the mind, or are derived from the author of our being. Nor is such a question any way material to our present purpose. We may draw inferences from the coherence of our perceptions, whether they be true or false, whether they represent nature justly or be mere illusions of the senses. When we search for the characteristic which distinguishes the memory from the imagination, we must immediately perceive that it cannot lie in the simple ideas it presents to us, since both these faculties borrow their simple ideas from the impressions and can never go beyond these original perceptions. These faculties are as little distinguished from each other by the arrangement of their complex ideas. For though it be a peculiar property of the memory to preserve the original order and position of its ideas, while the imagination transposes and changes them as it pleases, yet this difference is not sufficient to distinguish them in their operation, or make us know the one from the other, it being impossible to recall the past impressions in order to compare them with our present ideas and see whether their arrangement be exactly similar. Since, therefore, the memory is known neither by the order of its complex ideas nor the nature of its simple ones, it follows that the difference betwixt it and the imagination lies in its superior force and vivacity. A man may indulge his fancy in feigning any past scene of adventures, nor would there be any possibility of distinguishing this from a remembrance of a like kind were not the ideas of the imagination fainter and more obscure. It frequently happens that when two men have been engaged in any scene of action, the one shall remember it much better than the other, and shall have all the difficulty in the world to make his companion recollect it. He runs over several circumstances in vain, mentions the time, the place, the company, what was said, what was done on all sides, till at last he hits on some lucky circumstance that revives the whole and gives his friend a perfect memory of everything. Here, the person that forgets receives at first all the ideas from the discourse of the other with the same circumstances of time and place, though he considers them as mere fictions of the imagination. But as soon as the circumstance is mentioned that touches the memory, the very same ideas now appear in a new light, and have, in a manner, a different feeling from what they had before. Without any other alteration beside that of the feeling, they become immediately ideas of the memory and are assented to.
Okay, that's an interesting observation. I can rule out that I have actually had that kind of experience. It's not something I've sort of noticed or, focused on, but I think he's onto something. That let's say that I was, there's an old sketch in Denmark by somebody. Never mind. Um, that you try to somebody you had a friendship with, let's say 20 years ago, right? And you sort of recall what you did. Maybe it's part of getting older, right? But Hume was 28 or something back then, so he shouldn't have any problems remembering shit. But when you sort of recall back 20 years, 25 years, and then you say, well, don't you remember then when we were there? And the other guy says, no, I can't remember. I don't remember anything about that. And then sort of, but there was this, this person, with the hat, and there was that car that was green, and you keep going and mentioning, part of your memory of that particular situation. And at some point, you might, don't you remember that woman with the very weird, flowery dress? And then the guy, oh yeah, that's right. The woman with the flowery dress. Oh yeah, now I remember. It was when we was doing this, that, this, that, this, that. So it's almost forgotten, but it's still sort of in the depths of memory, right? That particular thing that is still a part of accessible memory basically brings back most, if not all, of the rest of the memory of that situation, because it's sort of confined into a situation that has certain aspects, like that woman with that particular dress. But when that is what triggers the remembrance, then the rest of the situation seems to be able to appear, right? So some people say that it's only 20% of your brain that is being used. Well, yeah, or maybe it's only 20. There's 80% that is sort of a remote magazine of memories that are not particularly being used at this moment, right? Or something. I don't know, right? Then you can dig out if you punch the right hole in it, right? Like Hume is trying to. Now, I'm not sure where he's trying to go with this, but I actually think, and I like when he does these kinds of examples, it becomes much more alive, his philosophy, to me, rather than the polemic, or I don't, that sounds negative, but very convoluted academic kind of argumentation. I like these direct references to my experiences, right?
Since, therefore, the imagination can represent all the same objects that the memory can offer to us, and since those faculties are only distinguished by the different feeling of the ideas they present, it may be proper to consider what is the nature of that feeling. And here, I believe, everyone will readily agree with me that the ideas of the memory are more strong and lively than those of the fancy. A painter who intended to represent a passion or emotion of any kind would endeavor to get a sight of a person actuated by a like emotion in order to enliven his ideas and give them a force and vivacity superior to what is found in those which are mere fictions of the imagination. The more recent this memory is, the clearer is the idea. And when, after a long interval, he would return to the contemplation of his object, he always finds its idea to be much decayed, if not wholly obliterated. We are frequently in doubt concerning the ideas of the memory, as they become very weak and feeble, and are at a loss to determine whether any image proceeds from the fancy or the memory, when it is not drawn in such lively colors as distinguish that latter faculty. I think I remember such an event, says one, but am not sure. A long tract of time has almost worn it out of my memory, and leaves me uncertain whether or not it be the pure offspring of my fancy.
Yes. So you can have memory of your abstract ideas, or you can have, yes, but let's say back in the day, now Hume is talking about paintings. He wouldn't know about photographs. It wasn't even for the next 100 years would be invented, right? That, if you think about back in your youth or childhood, a memory or something, are you absolutely sure whether or not your memory is your actual experience, or it's a photograph that you have incorporated into your memory, remembrance of this thing, and the photographs have actually taken place as a kind of memory of that thing that you experienced as if it was a real perception, right? So, and I think he's sort of grappling with this sort of gray zone between memories of actual perception or memories of ideas. So it's a difficult area to handle. He does it fairly well, I think.
And as an idea of the memory, by losing its force and vivacity, may degenerate to such a degree as to be taken for an idea of the imagination, so, on the other hand, an idea of the imagination may acquire such a force and vivacity as to pass for an idea of the memory and counterfeit its effects on the belief and judgment. This is noted in the case of liars, who by the frequent repetition of their lies come at last to believe and remember them as realities, custom and habit having in this case, as in many others, the same influence on the mind as nature, and in fixing the idea with equal force and vigor. Thus, it appears that the belief or assent which always attends the memory and senses is nothing but the vivacity of those perceptions they present, and that this alone distinguishes them from the imagination. To believe is in this case to feel an immediate impression of the senses or a repetition of that impression in the memory. It is merely the force and liveliness of the perception which constitutes the first act of the judgment and lays the foundation of that reasoning which we build upon it when we trace the relation of cause and effect. End of File 20. File 21 of a Treatise of
Okay, so I think I'll leave it here. More to come in his inference from the impressions to the idea. Okay, so we are dealing with this causation thing in a very deep and rigid manner, I think, and it's slightly convoluted in his usual fashion. Sometimes I lose connection with his thinking or his writing, I should say, and I zone out a bit sometimes where I try to grasp what he's saying, but I'm sort of having difficulties, right? So I'm staying in, okay, I'm listening and trying to make sense of it, but I don't want to take each sentence and it would be way too cumbersome, right? So in this fashion, I have my own ideas and I reflect back and forth to some extent. And when I hear something that could be an inspiration or which is different from mine or something that I might sort of, what the hell is he talking about? I don't understand it. So I'll reflect on that, right? But I don't want to over-interpret his sentence because there is a bit of language barrier, both that English is not my first language, and that is sort of 300-year-old English, right? So, although it's decently easy to understand, right? Despite or compared to some other philosophers I've read, right? That might be, read Descartes, it might be even harder, right? If you read Aristotle, it's unreadable almost to me, right? So I'll leave it there. See you in the next one.